Hello and welcome to the Pilgrim Way. My name is Norman Graham and I'm a minister in the Baptist Union of Churches in Scotland. The aim of these signposts is to try and help to connect the text of the Bible with our everyday lives. Continuing our series in the book of Daniel, I'm going to read from Daniel chapter 1 beginning at verse 8. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God has caused the official to show favour and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I am afraid of the Lord, my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and so they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Well, last week we kind of reflected on the severe faithfulness of God as he brought the judgments of the covenant against his people who were really reaping what they had sown for their rebellion and unfaithfulness. Of course, that truth poses a difficult question, for as the story unfolds, the obedient faithfulness of Daniel and his friends is obvious. So why were they taken into exile? Well, John Donne said that no man is an island. We are who we are in relation to others. While sometimes we find ourselves in a place we don't want to be because of our own sins or choices, sometimes we find ourselves in that place because of the sins and choices of others. God was judging the nation, and Daniel and his friends were caught up in the consequences of that judgment. And yet God was at work in it all, and through their painful experience of exile, God's name would be glorified at the very centre of the anti-God empire of Babylon. In the very next chapter, Nebuchadnezzar says to Daniel, Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings. In chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar praises, honours and glorifies God, acknowledging that God's kingdom is eternal and that he's the ultimate ruler of all. In chapter 6, King Darius issued a decree that throughout his kingdom, Daniel's God must be feared and reverenced. Whilst Daniel is telling us his story, his book is ultimately about God. It's a revelation of God and his sovereign purposes for the world. And these purposes for Daniel and his friends included exile. As we noted previously, the first chapter sets the scene for everything that follows, and that's especially true in terms of the obedient faithfulness of Daniel and his friends. Faithfulness that will be put to the test as the story unfolds. And their faithfulness is all the more remarkable considering their situation. Firstly, they were quite young. Excuse me. The Hebrew word used to describe them is the common word for children or young lads. And scholars are generally agreed that they were probably aged anywhere from 13 to 18 years old. However, their lack of years is contrasted with their highly prized skills and virtues. In the context of the chapter, their youthfulness teaches us a valuable lesson about God's sovereignty and man's responsibility. For the text tells us that these lads had an aptitude for learning. In other words, they applied themselves to the task of learning. But it's also made clear throughout their story that God gave them wisdom and understanding. In fact, Daniel was even given the ability to understand visions and interpret dreams. Whilst God gave them wisdom, that didn't mean they didn't need to study or pay attention in the class. Rather, it was as they diligently studied that God gave them wisdom and understanding about what they were studying. Secondly, as young lads, they experienced the brutality and violence of war firsthand, not like in a computer game. This was up close and personal, and without a doubt they would have been traumatised by what they'd seen and experienced. So no one can blame them if that trauma led them to abandon their faith in God, and there would have been plenty of people telling them that their God was weak or that their God didn't care about them. Yet their response was one of determined faithfulness. And thirdly, although the word slave is not mentioned, their lives were now lives of enforced servitude, in which they had no say and no choices. From that moment forward, every detail of their lives, for as long as they lived, would be determined by their captors. And lastly, from a cultural perspective, they had no longer had a meaningful future. For it's also likely that in order to enter into the service of the king in the palace, which would have included a harem of beautiful women, Daniel and his friends were castrated. I don't remember that being mentioned in the old hymn, Dare to be a Daniel. In the ancient Near Eastern cultures, children were seen as a blessing from God and an assurance that you'd be cared for in your old age, that your land would remain in the family and that your name would be remembered. So their world had not just been turned upside down, it had been ripped apart. And yet these young lads remained obstinately faithful to God. Unfortunately, that was not the end of their difficulties. The Babylonians engaged in a state-sponsored program of assimilating their captives into the Babylonian culture and worldview. In the case of the Hebrew captives, it was designed to strip away their Jewish identity, including their commitment to Yahweh, the God of Israel. From now on, they would dress like Babylonians, speak like Babylonians, and would read Babylonian literature with the expectation that they would adopt Babylonian customs and a Babylonian understanding of the meaning and purpose of life, and also probably they would be expected to worship the Babylonian gods. It was a deliberate program of assimilation that would transform them from being Israelites to being Babylonians. Perhaps most obviously, they would have also had to eat Babylonian foods. And although up to this point Daniel and his three friends have provided no recorded resistance to their assimilation into Babylonian society and culture, we now learn that Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. Now, why Daniel chose this issue as a point of resistance to Babylonian assimilation is really quite difficult to determine. The Hebrew word translated as defile, gal, occurs 9 times in the First Testament, and it always has religious connotations. Some scholars think that Daniel's rejection of the king's food was related to the observance of Jewish food laws, since the meat was most likely not kosher. However, we should note that Daniel also refused the wine, and wine was not forbidden under kosher food laws. And we should also note that the refusal to eat meat or drink wine wasn't permanent. In chapter 10, verse 3, Daniel was so troubled by a vision that he mourned for 3 weeks, and it says he ate no choice food or no meat or wine. So with that in mind, it's unlikely that keeping kosher was the motive for abstaining from them here. The majority of scholars therefore suggest that it had something to do with idolatry, for in the ancient world food would have been offered to the gods before being served, and so there was always a religious element to meals. In 1 Corinthians 8, Paul addresses the concerns about this very issue among believers who have converted from paganism. In the ancient world, virtually every social event involved eating meat that had been offered to idols. So avoiding idolatry would seem to be the point of avoiding the king's food. Except for the fact that the vegetables that they did agree to eat would also have been offered to the gods. And as we have noted later in the story, Daniel speaks about eating meat, and so that makes avoiding idolatry an unlikely motive for the resistance in this case. Theologian Tremper Longman suggests that the motive for Daniel's resistance might be more closely related to the story. He notes that Daniel and his 3 friends are in a process of education and preparation for service. Their minds as well as their bodies are being fed by the Babylonian court. And if they prospered, then to whom would they attribute their development and success? Well, naturally the Babylonians. However, by refusing to eat the food of the king, they know it's not the king who's responsible for the fact that they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the other young men who did eat the royal food. Their robust appearance, usually attained by a rich fare of meats and wine, is miraculously achieved through a diet of vegetables. They know what the king doesn't, that God has done this. And if nothing else, it would confirm Daniel's conviction that it was God who'd brought them to Babylon, that it was God, not Nebuchadnezzar, who was controlling events. It often goes unnoticed, but despite being given favour in the eyes of the king's official, the official refused Daniel's request. It's clear from the text that whatever goodwill he had towards Daniel, he was afraid of the consequences if Daniel's plan didn't work out. Not the least that the king might have his head. Daniel's response was to go to plan B. And so he made a similar request of their guard, and he was more willing to go along with it for a limited time. It's possible that the guard helped himself to the choice foods that Daniel and his friends refused to eat. Furthermore, this seems to have been a private arrangement between Daniel and the guard, so the guard had plausible deniability. As Longman notes, they made no public proclamation of their intentions. They staged no food strikes. What this all tells us is that God's purposes can be resisted, but that ultimately they cannot be refused. Or as Paul says in Romans 8, that God will work all things together, even human resistance. Now, in an earlier message, I said that the anti-God culture of the 6th century Babylon was similar to ours, and that Daniel and his friends might be a model for us as we seek to live faithfully for God in the kind of anti-God culture that we live in today. But the challenge for us then is to work out to what extent Daniel is a model for us. The reality is that the two cultures are similar, but they're not the same. Daniel was writing a historical account of God's actions in 6th century Babylon, not a blueprint for Christian behaviour in the 21st century. The two cultures are not the same, but they are similar, especially in one particular aspect. In his translation of the New Testament, J.B. Phillips famously translates Romans 12:2 as, "Don't let the world around you squeeze you into its own mould." And that's something that Christians today really have to grasp and deal with. We have to understand that whilst the process of assimilation may vary from culture to culture and age to age and person to person, nonetheless, the world around us is always trying to assimilate us. It's always trying to squeeze us into its own mould, to adopt its ethos, its values, and its practices. And sometimes that squeeze is very obvious and direct. Professor John Lennox has written about his experience as a student and being told by a Nobel laureate that if he wanted to have a successful career in science, he must give up his childish ideas of God. Of course, he didn't do that, and yet he went on to get degrees from both Oxford and Cambridge and an international career in mathematics. The squeeze also comes indirectly, simply because we live in a culture in which the moral values that are contrary to our beliefs have become the accepted values of our society and are all around us every day. Some of those anti-God values have even been enshrined in law. The effect of that is to make Christians and people of other faiths seem out of touch, backward, judgmental, narrow-minded bigots. In fact, that's one of the worst things that can happen to you in our culture, is to be called a bigot on social media. But it's social media, it's TV, it's radio, it's newspapers, it's the people around us are all trying to squeeze us into the mould of our culture, to adopt the values and practices and ethos of the world around us, a world that is largely opposed to God. In the 21st century, a significant response of the church to that kind of that pressure, that squeeze of the world against us, and the anti-God culture of the West, is to seek political power in order to make the culture Christian by enacting laws that would do that. In the United States, this is seen most clearly in the dramatic rise of the so-called Christian nationalism movement. And I would say that not only is that movement not Christian, its basic premise is false. For there is no such thing as a Christian nation. There never has been, and there never will be. The Bible recognizes only two kingdoms, the kingdom of God and the kingdom of the world. And you can belong to one or the other, but not both. We cannot Christianize society by writing or overturning laws. It can only happen as we live and tell the gospel and see people come to faith in Jesus as their saving King and surrender their lives to Him, adopting the values and ethos of the kingdom of God. We cannot use the tools of the world to advance the kingdom of God. And it's on this point that Daniel acts as a model for us about how to live in an anti-God culture. Daniel doesn't demand his rights to eat only kosher food, or to speak in his native language, or to dress like a Jew. He doesn't fire off angry posts on Facebook and Twitter denouncing others. Rather, he accepts that there will be restrictions on his faith in a Babylonian society. But he looks for opportunities to live out that faith in the midst of a culture that's hostile to it. He doesn't seek to overturn the culture. He seeks to live faithfully for God, knowing that that will cause other people to come to God. When the opportunity arose, such as interpreting a dream, he always took the opportunity to direct the king's attention to God as the one who gave the interpretation. So actually, for the most part, his faith was, to a certain extent, private. And yet it was public enough that his enemies knew that he prayed 3 times a day. And there were lines that he wouldn't cross, such as praying to the king as though the king were a god. In other words, he responded differently to each situation as was appropriate. And his response anticipates the teaching of Jesus, firstly in John 17, verses 15 to 18, that's often summarized in a phrase that we should be in the world, but not of it. Although preachers like to fill in the blanks, Jesus doesn't clarify how exactly we are to be not of the world whilst in it. As one scholar notes, it's a general principle that can be lived out in a variety of ways. Daniel and his friends refused to eat the meat and wine supplied by the king, but they were diligent in their studies as commanded by the king, and in fact graduated top of the class. Daniel refused to stop praying to his God, even though it would mean his death. And his friends were thrown in a fiery furnace for refusing to go along with idolatrous worship. Daniel's response also anticipates Matthew 10 and 16, that we should be shrewd as snakes and innocent as doves. Daniel had to be shrewd in order to live out his faith in such a hostile environment, and so must we. He knew when to take a stand and when to be silent, and so must we. He was also innocent. He wasn't a rebel. He didn't start an anti-Nebuchadnezzar resistance movement. He always spoke to people with civility and kindness, and he always seemed to respect the authority of others. In chapter 6, we are told that his colleagues tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." I wonder if our families and friends and colleagues could say that about us. Have we bought too much into the values and ethos of the world around us? Have we allowed the world to squeeze us into its mould enough that our distinctiveness as followers of Jesus is no longer obvious? Daniel's story reminds us of a truth that we need to be reminded of in these days. That the society around us is constantly seeking to assimilate us into its God-denying worldview. And the story also reminds us that despite all evidence to the contrary, God is in control. And what that means for us, what it meant for Daniel, is that resistance against the assimilation of the world is not futile. God will always make a way for us to be faithful to him in the world. And the Bible tells us, resist the devil and he will flee. What we have to do in these days is put on the full armour of God and stand firm. We have to be as wise as serpents and as innocent as doves, and live faithfully, knowing that there will be restrictions on our faith in a society that rejects that faith. But it's not by political means that we will change that. It's only as the hearts and lives of men and women are changed by the Spirit of God, as they surrender their lives to Jesus, that will change. And so our task, urgently, is to live and tell the gospel. Thanks for listening.